All right, well, hello guys. Let's try this again. For some reason, had some technical difficulties and the thing just shut off in the middle of that. So we're going to try to do this one as a two-parter. So let's hope this works and try to do some things that we think have fixed it. So hopefully we can get finished with this. So, and I was recording the other part last night, so this is actually on Friday here. So I think I was talking about salutary neglect. Forgive me if that's not correct, but I think I was kind of in the middle of that. So the British had passed these trade laws, and so they really didn't enforce them. And so the bottom line is the colonists, they smuggled, they did a lot of things. They basically ignored the law, and they got used to doing whatever it was they wanted to do because the British really weren't enforcing the policy. And so people just weren't obeying the law. Well, that might work out fine as long as everything stays the same. But as we're about to see, everything's not going to stay the same. 1763, this is all going to change. Well, why would the British pass a law or a series of laws that they weren't going to enforce? That sounds kind of crazy. Well, it's not like they intended to neglect the law and not enforce it. There are going to be some factors that are going to prevent them from really controlling colonial trade, that will prevent them from enforcing the Navigation Acts. Some of these we've already talked about. So one factor was all the internal conflicts. The English, of course, had a civil war. They went through Cromwell and got rid of the monarchy, and then brought the monarchy back. They went through the Glorious Revolution. So they'd had a lot of issues between the Catholics and Protestants, and the Act of Settlement, and all those different things. And so that was occupying a lot of the attention of the British government, and so they weren't paying so much attention to what was going on in the 13 North American colonies. Who cares what's going on in Boston or Philadelphia when we got these issues? Secondly, during a lot of this period, in the 16 and 1700s, the British were fighting a series of 4 wars with France. They were always fighting with France about something. So think about it. If you're going to enforce trade policies, well, how do you do that if you're the British? Well, you got to use your Navy. That's what you got to do. Well, the Navy was busy fighting the French fleet. So, if you're a British warship captain, you got to, okay, well, let's see. We got a smuggler from Boston over here on the left. On the right, we got a French warship that's lobbing cannonballs at us. I wonder which one we're going to deal with. You're not so worried about the smuggler at that point. You got to deal with the guy who's trying to kill you. So the British Navy was pretty busy with these wars with France, and they just really couldn't enforce it. And then finally, you had really bad communication. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have cell phones and all that kind of stuff today or back then. So it was really hard to rule a place from 3,000 miles away. There was no regular postal service. If the king issued an order, he had to wait for a ship was going to America. That might be a week or two or whatever, and then you go across, and assuming it makes it, that's several more weeks, and then it gets to America, and the postal guys, they deliver it whenever they feel like it. Finally gets to the governor. Oh, okay, the king wants me to do this. He writes back to the king, and the whole process goes in reverse, and you're talking months or almost a year before they could have a round-trip communication that you and I could do virtually instantaneously. So it made it really hard to control the colonies from 3,000 miles away where the British government was. So anyway, those things went on until 1763. The French and Indian War ends, and this changes everything. Now, 2 of those 3 factors are gone. England is through with the internal conflicts. They're through with the wars with France. They do still have the bad communication, but the other 2 are gone. So they're now going to turn their attention to the colonies and kind of crack down on their enforcement of the different laws that they want the colonists to obey. Now, the key thing that's going to bring all this to the crux is the idea of the war debt from the French and Indian War. And so from the British point of view, they believe they did it for the colonists. The colonists were complaining that they were having trouble with the French colonists and they were having trouble with the Indians. So the British government said, well, we fought this thing for you. We borrowed a bunch of money to fight it. You were going to have to raise your taxes. You're going to have to pay your fair share of the war debt. From the colonial point of view, they thought, well, that's not right. We already pay taxes for you to protect us. Now you want to charge us extra for doing the job you were supposed to do anyway. So we don't think that's fair. So obviously they don't want to pay the taxes. And this is where a lot of the argument comes from between the British Crown and the British colonists in North America. And so the colonists are going to protest. Again, this is not an American history class, so we're just kind of quickly going through this, leaving out a lot of details. We just kind of want to see the effect on Europe's the main thing. So the colonists are going to protest a lot. The British are going to punish them in various ways. And so one thing leads to another over this, and this is eventually going to cause what has become known as the American Revolution. And where this really starts for a long time, again, basically from 1763 until 1775, you have a lot of arguing and protesting and, harsh words back and forth. But everything's going to change on April 19th, 1775, with Lexington and Concord. And this is where blood is actually going to be shed, and that's a game changer. Okay, so what happens here is Massachusetts had been basically placed under what we would call kind of like martial law, military command, because of things they had done, and they were being punished. And so the military there was under the command of Thomas Gage, G-A-G-E, Thomas Gage. So he's the British commander there. And it comes to his attention that a group of colonists called the Sons of Liberty, they have stockpiled some weapons in a little town called Concord. And so Gage decides to send 700 British regulars, British soldiers, to go get the weapons before somebody does something stupid. So he said, go get the weapons, bring them back to Boston, we'll lock them up before anybody can do something crazy. So Gage is really trying to prevent a war, but he actually winds up starting one. So the British Army marches off. Well, they meet militia resistance in Lexington. They have the road blocked. One thing leads to another. They get into a skirmish. Some British soldiers are killed. Some American colonists are killed. The colonists are heavily outnumbered, therefore they retreat. The British think that's the end of it. They march on to Concord. Well, meanwhile, the colonists that have retreated, they've gone to tell their friends and neighbors, hey, the British Army has fired on and killed some of your friends and neighbors. So to imagine what this would be like today, guys, this would be like for us if the United States Army came to Cleveland and just shot and killed some American citizens in Cleveland. You could imagine how that would impact us and how outraged we would be. So it's one thing to argue about things, but it's another thing when your own government starts shooting you. And so this is a real game changer. So when the British Army gets to Concord, they are met by thousands of militia members. They fight another skirmish. This time the British are outnumbered, and so they retreat back to Boston. Again, we're leaving out a lot of details here, just kind of giving you the basic facts. So this is in May of 1775. So in April in 1775. So in May of 1775, the colonists respond by creating the Second Continental Congress, which will meet in Philadelphia, and they're trying to decide what to do about this. Again, blood has been shed. This is a new dynamic of their conflict here, of the argument that they'd been having. Well, they decided they need to create an army to begin with. They're going to appoint George Washington to be the commander of the Continental Army. You might have heard of him once or twice. He's kind of important. And they continue to try to make a deal with the king. They still can try to continue to put forth peaceful efforts. The king is not in any mood to compromise, as again, he's got a mental disease that might have something to do with his inflexibility. He believes they should just obey him, and that's the end of it. And so he only wants to punish them. He doesn't really want to compromise. So a lot of the colonists at this point, they still want to remain part of the British Empire if the king would just respect their rights as Englishmen, which is what they feel like he's not doing and Parliament's not doing. Well, eventually you get to about a year later, in July of 1776, they finally get enough support for the independence movement, and they decide, you know what, we just need to completely separate from England. We don't need to be part of them anymore. And so they write a Declaration of Independence. The primary author of this is going to be Thomas Jefferson. And this document, of course, is heavily influenced by the ideas of John Locke, who we talked about a little bit earlier in the chapter. And Locke, again, had said there was a social contract. The people agree to obey the government as long as their rights are protected: life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changes it to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So the document will argue that our rights are not being supported by the government. Therefore, like Locke said, we have a right to overthrow it because it is oppressive. And we're just going to create our own country. And so this really begins the American Revolution in earnest at this point. So the war situation is, simply put, the British have most all the advantages. They are the superpower at this point. They have a professional, well-trained army. They have the biggest navy in the world. We don't have a navy at all. Our soldiers are mainly farmers, and the good thing is they can shoot because they hunt a lot, but they're not professionally trained soldiers like the British are. The colonists are continually short on money. The British have plenty of money. So all the advantages seem to be working toward the British, and the Americans winning this thing was pretty much miraculous, and that's the way George Washington described it. But we are able to pull it off. One thing that really helps us is that France and Spain and the Netherlands are all going to help us in the American Revolution to fight against the British. Now, do they care anything about American independence? Of course not. They don't care anything. They just hate the British. So they see this as a good opportunity, especially France is thinking, oh, England just drove us out of North America. This would be hilarious if we could help the colonists drive them out of North America. So it's all about revenge, and they just don't like the British. But from our point of view, hey, you know what? We'll take the help, however we can get it. So they help us quite a bit. That means England has to divide their forces, and they can't focus everything on us. Now, one really important thing that you want to take out of this, again, it's not American history, so how does this impact Europe? Well, the common people in Europe see what we're doing over here, the American colonists fighting against the greatest power on earth. They see this as a symbol of the Enlightenment. This is symbolic of what the Enlightenment was all about: more power to the people, more freedom. We don't want the absolute power of the government. So they saw it as a symbol of the Enlightenment, and it inspires them tremendously. And one of the initial things that's going to come out of this, of course, will be the French Revolution. But we're going to see it's going to send shock waves throughout Europe. And that's really, as we go forward, what we kind of want to focus on. Well, let's look at just a couple of important battles real quickly. We're not going to talk details, but Saratoga in 1777. I mention this because this is the turning point of the American Revolution. The Americans managed to win the Battle of Saratoga, and this is the turning point because this is when we get foreign help, especially from France. They had been kind of secretly helping us with some money and some ammo and things like that. Now France openly declares war on Britain. Once we win at Saratoga, France thinks, hey, these Americans, they may actually have a shot at this. And so they openly come in on our side, and they bring their navy in, and it's a huge big deal. So that's why we mentioned Saratoga. And then also the Battle of Yorktown. It's really more of a siege than a battle. This is when the British Army, under the command of Charles Cornwallis, he has to surrender. They're cut off from retreat, and he has to surrender his entire army to George Washington. And for all intents and purposes, this ends the American Revolution. This is when we start negotiating peace terms. And so, remember yesterday or whenever it was, we talked about the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Well, this is the one of 1783 that ends the American Revolution, and it recognizes the United States of America as a free and independent nation. Well, now that we've got our independence, now what? What are we supposed to do? Well, you've got to create a government. You've got to create a system. Everything had been done by the British, and you don't really have a blueprint of how to do this. So this is going to be kind of a difficult process, but we do manage to do this. And there's Jefferson and the surrender at Yorktown, a really cool story that goes with that. But again, you'd have to take my other class, and we go into detail about that. It's really pretty funny. Kind of the whole situation that goes down there. All right, so now that we have our own country, What are we going to do? Well, we create our first government, which is known as the Articles of Confederation. And as you can see by the dates, this doesn't last very long, really, because it's really bad. So remember earlier we talked about Martin Luther, and when he rebelled against the Catholic Church, the Catholics were all about works. Luther was all about faith. He went from one extreme to the other. And we said the truth is probably, somewhere in the middle. Here's another example of that. So we rebel against the British. We get free of them. We go from one extreme to the other. We go from an oppressive government to a really weak government that doesn't have the authority to do anything. The Confederation Congress could not even pass taxes. They couldn't tax the people. So it's hard for a government to do much when they don't have any money at all. But the Americans were so upset about taxes, they just said, we're not going to give them, they can ask for money, and you know how much people are going to give when you just ask for it. So this government was way too weak. It couldn't solve any problems, and that's why it doesn't last very long. So they figure this out, and they decide to meet in Philadelphia to draw up a new government. The original purpose was to amend the Articles, but they decide, let's just trash it, and let's start all over. So they're going to create something known as the United States Constitution, which at least theoretically we're still under here in 2020. And so this document is a masterpiece of government engineering, basically, and it's based on the ideas of all these people. Okay, Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu specifically. So you see some philosophers there, and their ideas. Locke, of course, is about everybody has these natural rights, the government should protect them. Rousseau, again, was big about freedom of speech, freedom of thought, those kind of things. Montesquieu, of course, had the separation of the powers. We want to split things out. And so our founding fathers are going to split things out in a couple of ways. One is they're going to create something called a federal system. And you see that up there, a federal system. This just means the power of the government. Again, they fought a revolution to get away from a king and an oppressive parliament. So they want to divide the power. So they're going to divide the power into three. This is kind of like a vertical separation. So you're going to have the national government, you're going to have the state governments, and then you're going to have the local governments. They all have different powers. There are things that each of them can and cannot do. The idea was to share the power and not let any one person or small group of people dominate. And again, this is going to send ripples through Europe as well as they see how we do this. Then from Montesquieu, we get the idea of the three branches of government. So you're going to have national, state, and local. And then at the national government, it's going to be further divided into the three branches, which, of course, are the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The idea, again, was where no one branch or no one group or no one person would have too much power in the government. So, again, that's executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. Those ideas come from Montesquieu. Well, in 1791, again, we're skipping a lot of things. We're just kind of cutting to the chase here. A Bill of Rights is going to be added to the United States Constitution. It is somewhat modeled on the English Bill of Rights, which again was written about a little over 100 years earlier in 1789. In 1689. We start writing ours in 1789, but in 1791 it will be ratified and added to the Constitution. And this is the first 10 amendments, is what we know as the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments. You got freedom of speech, freedom of religion, search and seizure, cruel and unusual punishment, right to a jury. There's all kinds of things in there. Okay? And James Madison, who wrote these, made it very clear, and this is what Americans still don't understand today, and this is what gets us in trouble. These are not rights that the government gives us. These were God-given rights, and Madison was very clear about that, because if the government gives you the right, that also means the government has the authority to take it away. And Madison didn't want that, so he said these were God-given. You're born with these rights. It's the government's job to protect your rights. They can't give them to you, nor can they take them away. You just automatically have them, and the government is supposed to protect those rights. Okay? So the idea of the Bill of Rights was to protect the American people from government oppression. That was the whole purpose of the Bill of Rights. So a lot of people mistakenly think, oh, those are the rights the government gives us. It couldn't be further from the truth. And again, in my other class, we spend a whole lot of time on the Bill of Rights and going kind of in detail into this fascinating story as you learn those type of things. And so this inspired a lot of people in the short term in Europe, as we're going to talk about next chapter, the French Revolution, and in other ways, but it also continues to inspire people. So usually around the world today, whenever a group of people tries to fight for their freedom against an oppressive government, they normally always quote the Declaration of Independence, the United States Declaration of Independence. So this has been an inspiration, was and still is, to many people around the world. All right, so let's finish up. The last thing we're going to look at today, and this is of our prime focus here. What did this demonstrate? What was the impact of the American Revolution? What shock waves does it send into Europe? How's this going to affect the way people in Europe think? And it does affect the way they think. And that's kind of one of the main things we're going to take away from this. So what ideas did it demonstrate? Well, number one, it showed that a government could be created without monarchs and without nobles. There were no nobles in America. There was no elite, landowning class like that. There were landowners, but we didn't have titles, the Duke of this or the Earl of that. None of that existed in America. So you can have a government without a monarchy, and you don't need nobles either. And of course, the whole European system was built on those things. Well, we showed you don't need that. Secondly, we showed that a nation could be governed by written documents, not by a king, but by written documents that were based on popular consent, based on the will of the people, not the will of a single monarch who claimed that God put him there. So we showed divine right was not necessary, and again, England had already kind of turned away from that. So we didn't believe in divine right. We did not believe in the will of kings or in the traditions that the Europeans clung to. And this type of thinking is going to trickle down into Europe and really going to influence a lot of their common people to rethink their relationship with their respective governments. Okay, and then finally, this established a new political and legal authority, which was the people. The whole Constitution, if you look at the Constitution, you see those three words it leads off with, we the people, written bigger than anything else. The idea was that the people would control the government rather than the government controlling the people. And that's really is turning the world upside down. And so those types of ideas are going to trickle over into Europe as well, not just in France, but in a lot of other places. And it's really going to start to turn the tide. And so, again, we talked about this as the conflict that we're really looking at, the monarchs who have the power against the common people who want to get more power for themselves. The American Revolution is a big factor in leading other people in Europe to do that. All right, so that finishes up chapter 6. And so Miss O'Brien sent out a thing today that you guys probably have heard by this point. Because of all this uncertainty, we don't want to punish anybody, and I wholeheartedly agree with that philosophy. We don't want people's grades really to be hurt by this pandemic and something that we can't control. And so they've requested that, for the time being anyway, we kind of suspend grading stuff. So we're going to do that too. So I'm not going to assign any more, vocab or anything like that right now. I am the DBQ that you just did. You did that under the expectation that was going to be a grade, so it will be. I'll put that back on the third 9 weeks. But for the next few weeks anyway, until we figure all this out, they don't want us doing a whole lot of grading stuff right now. We need to continue, because what I'm trying to get you guys ready for is this AP test. And they did send me a survey today and asked my opinion on several things, and I don't know if they'll listen or not, but I gave them my 2 cents worth. If they would cancel that test, that would be great maybe, but I don't think they're going to do that. So we've still got to try to get ready for it. And so what I encourage you to do is, we're not going to do the vocab, but please continue to take good notes. Please study your notes. Please do the reading that I'm asking you to do. I really want you guys to get your college credit. I really would love to see you guys get college credit for this class, and then you don't have to take it when you get to college. So I'm still going to try to do my best to prepare you for this test. I encourage you to go to those online sessions and look at those. We are still going to practice some more of the different types of free response questions, because that's what the exam is going to be. And so we'll do those. I'll talk more about those a little bit later, but at the end of each unit, I'll give you another one, so at least you can practice doing those. But, I'm not going to let it hurt your grade or punish you in that sense. But you need to try to do the best you can on it. Hopefully I can give you some feedback, and that way you can do well on the real test when it comes up. All right, so this is Friday. So here's your reading for the weekend. So this is Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So I would break this down and go ahead and turn in your vocab. You've got vocab due for this chapter. Do it 8 o'clock Monday night. So go ahead, because I know a lot of you have already done that. So let's go ahead and turn that in. But then I'm saying from chapter 7 onward, I'm not going to assign you any more vocab. And I will make sure you get some credit for doing this. If we have to put it back on the third 9 weeks or whatever, we'll do that. But from this point onward, I won't give you any more. All right, so here's the reading. So here's how I'd break it down, but you can do it any way you want. For Friday, read pages 333 to 351. Saturday, pages 273 to 290. And then Sunday, pages 291 to 301. All right, so to repeat that, on Friday, 333 to 351. Saturday, 273 to 290, and Sunday, 291 to 301. So try